Hello everyone. Tonight we won't just be listening to a story. We'll be traveling back in time, through the dust of thousands of years of history, to step into the heart of a dying empire, Babylon. The dark night covers the ancient walls. Flickering oil lamps cast shadows in a room thick with resin and sweat. In that dim light, a body lies motionless, no decay, no coldness, no discoloration, only silence and fear.
Alexander was a man who had a mission, and he knew that mission entailed risk.
Ready the troops.
Alexander the Great, the man who conquered half the world, now lies still like a statue, but no one dares to call him dead. Tonight, you'll hear about his final days, not his legendary victories, but a prolonged, strange, agonizing death. A death without certainty, a body that doesn't decompose, a king who might still be alive, inside his very own coffin. So before you start to relax, hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly feel what I share here is worth it. And by the way, drop a comment to let me know, what city are you in, and what time is it for you right now? I want to see how many places around the world we're connecting from tonight. Now, turn off the lights. Maybe switch on a small fan for a soft background hum. And let's step into tonight's journey together.
Crows.
Not for the men who fought, I trust.
We'll pay them well and
Philip never saw Babylon.
No, he didn't devise it.
The lights in the room dimmed, as if even the light itself dared not expose the truth lying on the bed in the great hall. Alexander, who once stood atop the world, was now a motionless figure amidst frozen silence. Outside, the city of Babylon still breathed, but it was a heavy, labored breath. Ancient canals curved beneath a dark purple sky, reflecting silent stars. Birds flew overhead without a sound. Wind whistled through stone columns like a sigh from history itself. Everything in the city seemed to know something immense was happening, something language could not yet name. In the room, none of the generals dared speak. They stood in a circle, eyes full of torment. No one wanted to be the first to step forward, because no one was certain he was dead. His body wasn't stiff. His skin hadn't paled. There was no smell of decay. Even insects stayed away. They waited one day, then another. Each hour stretched into eternity. 6 days had passed, and he still looked as if asleep. Some whispered it was a divine sign that Alexander had become a god, welcomed to the heavens by Zeus. But others, more discreet and grounded, looked at each other with creeping dread, because if it wasn't divine, what was it? A curse? An unknown disease? Or something worse than death itself, a man buried alive in his own body? They said when the embalmers came to examine him. They hesitated. The body was still warm, his eyes not yet clouded. They were afraid to touch him, afraid to misname a living man as dead. So they stepped back, burned more incense, and waited. Another day, then another. Alexander still lay there, beautiful, like a statue carved from moonlight. But no one knew whether, beneath that skin, someone was still watching. They say that before slipping away, he had a fever, not a normal fever, but a fire that burned inward, a slow, smoldering blaze that scorched every nerve, every joint, every cell. And in that fever, Alexander remained conscious. His eyes still followed the servants. His mouth tried to move, but his tongue no longer obeyed. His limbs would not respond. He was trapped inside his own body, chained by flesh, while his mind remained wide awake. This was no longer glory or power. This was hell. At night, they heard him moan, not in pleading, but in rage. Rage that the body which once crossed glaciers, once rode through deserts, now could not rise from a bed. They said he whispered the names of gods, of his mother, of a lost lover. Sometimes he screamed in Greek, in Persian, even in languages no one understood. Guards swore they saw him cry not for pain, but because he could no longer give orders. Death came slowly, so slowly that no one dared to say it had arrived. When he could no longer speak, they leaned close to listen. When he no longer blinked, they stood watch as if those open eyes were still commanding them. One day, he seemed to stop breathing, but his body did not change color. No odor, no cold. They didn't dare declare him dead. They simply said, "He is resting." And so he lay there, in a vast hall draped in white cloth, guarded day and night, like a god who had yet to decide whether to leave the mortal world. During that time, the empire he built began to tremble. One by one, people started to calculate who would succeed him, who was strong enough to carry the light of a man who had set the world ablaze with a single ambition. But when no one dared step toward the throne ceased to exist. Only fear remained, and silence. Can you imagine it? An empire stretching from Greece to India, millions awaiting command, and at the center of it all, a single room where everyone stood staring, afraid to breathe. Alexander lay there, saying nothing, unmoving, but also not decaying, as if his body had signed a maintenance pause contract with death itself. The generals began to panic, not out of sorrow, no, but because who dared to be the first to declare, "The king has passed"? No one wanted to be the first to slap an expiration date on a ruler whose eyes were still open and who seemed to be checking who was loyal and who wasn't. So they did the one thing humans always do when they don't know what to do. They delayed, burned more incense, called more priests, argued about where he should be buried, and of course, discussed who should temporarily steer the ship of the empire. Sound familiar? Like a board meeting where the CEO suddenly disappears without leaving the password. At that moment, one of the generals stood up and suggested, "What if we just ask him?" The whole room turned like he'd just proposed ordering pizza at a funeral. But then, they actually tried it. They leaned in and asked, "Are you still alive, Your Majesty?" Alexander didn't answer, but one eyelid seemed to twitch. "Who should succeed you?" No answer. But his mouth curled slightly, maybe a smile, maybe a muscle spasm. So they did the most logical thing in an illogical situation. They interpreted his facial expressions as a vague last will. Legend says he whispered 3 words, "To the strongest," a grand, powerful statement until you realize it was also the opening line of a 40-year brawl. Imagine this, you're dying, body frozen, tongue paralyzed, and the last thing you manage to utter is a short sentence. And instead of taking it as a cue for peace, they use it as the battle cry for royal free for all season 1. Just because of 3 words that everyone confidently claimed, "Oh, he meant me." Dua. One thought the strongest meant him because he had the biggest army. Another figured it was him because he married the most influential woman. Yet another said, "I'm his second cousin on his aunt's side, totally legit." Meanwhile, Alexander's body still lay there, eyes wide open, maybe looking at the heavens, or maybe wondering why he hadn't even closed his eyes before becoming the excuse for a round of empire-dividing monopoly. And don't forget his wife, Roxana. She was pregnant, meaning she might have been carrying the only legitimate heir, but Roxana wasn't naive. She knew well, in this world, newborns don't rule. Newborns are just tools for adults to grab power in their name. And Alexander? Perhaps he was silently thinking, "I spent my life conquering East and West. And in the end, honestly, If there's any historical moment that deserves to be called the original Game of Thrones, it's this Babylon, 323 BC. With a king's corpse lying in the middle of a room like a sacred artifact no one dared to touch, but everyone wanted to claim. The problem was, he wouldn't rot. And that was a serious problem, because in the ancient world, when someone dies, they're supposed to decay in a timely manner. That's how the universe confirms, okay. This player is out, but Alexander, nope. 6 days, then 7, then 8. Skin still glowing, cheeks still rosy, limbs soft, like he just left a spa. Result, no one dared to declare him dead. Because, if they were wrong, and he got up well, goodbye, General. Hello, Blasphemer-in-Chief. Because if anyone ever claimed to be the son of Zeus, it was him. So they went with the classic approach. Act solemn, while quietly spiraling into chaos. Secret meetings sprouted like mushrooms after rain. Some proposed burying him in Macedonia, his homeland. Others insisted, no, it has to be Egypt. He was crowned pharaoh there. Then there were the symbolic types, chewers of betel leaves and lovers of omens, who proposed building a tomb right in Babylon. Atop a tower, next to a river, under some star that looked auspicious. Oh, of course. No one really cared where he wanted to be buried. What they cared about was, wherever he's buried becomes the new center of the empire. And where there's a center, there's power. Meanwhile, Alexander's body still lay there, as if silently saying, did anyone ask me? No? All right. Carry on. Then one day, it happened. The body was stolen. Yes, you heard that right. It wasn't a bloody theft. It was theft by resolution. One of the generals, named Ptolemy, you know, the ancestor of Cleopatra, quietly redirected the funeral procession. The grand convoy, dripping with gold and incense, was originally planned to head north, but with a bit of friendly persuasion, it veered toward Egypt, and no one dared stop it, because, you see, no one was officially in charge of the funeral since no one was entirely sure Alexander was truly dead. The body was transported under the blazing sun, across deserts, past temples, over borders like a sacred treasure, and also a ticking political time bomb. And just like that, Egypt got the divine remains, while Babylon plunged into crisis. The other generals, of course, weren't pleased, but instead of attacking Egypt, risking troops, honor, and lives, they chose the smarter route, loudly declaring betrayal, while quietly preparing for war. As for Ptolemy, he stood in the temple at Memphis, gazing at Alexander's body like he'd just scored the greatest PR stunt in history. Imagine it, you're founding a new kingdom, and you've got the body of a living god, Sai no More. So a tomb was built, people gathered, Egyptian priests were summoned to perform the rites. Everything was solemn and grand, but inside Ptolemy's mind, there was surely a small, smug thought, now, who dares say I'm not legitimate? Meanwhile, back in Babylon, the air shifted. The tension was no longer silence. It was a competition of who could fake calm the best. Because if they couldn't fight for the body, they had to fight for the legacy. One man claimed to be the most trusted deputy. Another said, Alexander once gave me a secret mission. Others swore he'd winked at them in a way that clearly meant succession. The problem? No one was sure if he had ever even closed his eyes. The beauty or the curse of a body that won't decay is, it never goes away. And when someone doesn't rot, they can't be forgotten either. For weeks after the body was gently redirected by Ptolemy, the other generals pretended all was well. They held meetings. They divided territories. They poured wine for each other with smiles as stiff as limestone. And then, they drew the map. Now this part gets interesting. They rolled out the empire's map wide as a royal carpet stared at it in silence. Then began to cut, circle, mark, and trade. This part's mine. Okay? Sure. But I'll take this trade route then. No way. I have the port there. Fine. We'll split it. Lay, you'd think they were dividing land for the rightful heir. Nope, the heir was still inside Roxana, Alexander's official wife. And no one even knew yet if it was a boy or a long-term headache. And the second son, Heracles, born to the mistress Barsine, was kept sealed like classified intel, to be pulled out as a legal excuse when war was necessary. In short, the generals carved up the empire, while two children who couldn't even read had their names tossed around in council meetings like pieces of evidence. And Alexander's body, now resting in a glittering tomb in Egypt, beneath domes etched with gods and heroic feats. The public came to bow, priests whispered prayers, and some of the old generals began to feel a bit jealous. Did we just get played? The answer, yes. Ptolemy, with one smooth move, turned the king's corpse into a political title. He was no longer just a general. He was the keeper of the divine remains. Self-declared successor favored by the gods. Over in the east, Seleucus, another general, wasn't about to be left out. He sized Babylon, rebuilt its temples, renamed its cities, and minted coins with his own face. As if to say, no body, I've got the ancient capital and style in Europe. Lysimachus planted flags over Thrace. Antigonus swung his sword across Asia Minor, claiming to preserve unity by fighting everyone. Long story short, Alexander's empire officially shifted from being ruled to being sliced like a birthday cake with no candles. Each general became a new branch of power, each city a chess piece. And the people still paid taxes, though they no longer knew exactly to whom they belonged. The body in the tomb in Egypt grew more mysterious over time. People whispered that when candlelight hit the corpse, it glowed golden like sunlight. Some said standing near it gave off warmth. Others swore the eyes were still open. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. It worked better than 100 decrees, because wherever the body was, there was a spiritual center. And where there was spirit, there was funding. As for the remaining generals, they looked at one another. Then they looked toward Egypt. Each of them thought, if I had that body, maybe I'd become the true king too. But all of them feared becoming like Ptolemy hated as a royal-robed grave robber. So instead of reclaiming the body, they used one another as targets. The succession wars began. Not one war, but 5, 10, 20. The men who had once crossed deserts together, shared dry bread on horseback, now turned their blades on each other as if they had never been brothers. Alexander's empire was no longer an empire. It was a bleeding map, a legend torn into pieces, divided among those who once swore loyalty to the man lying beneath Egyptian silk. Rewind time, before he became the man who refused to die in the heart of Babylon. Before candles were lit beside his coffin like beside a god, Alexander was once a child. No sword, no armor, just a head of curly hair and a father who gave all of Greece a headache. He was born in 356 BCE, in the city of Pella, capital of the Kingdom of Macedonia, a land newly recognized as civilized, yet still viewed by traditional Greek city-states as provincial hillfolk. Alexander's father was Philip II, a brilliant king known for three things: political genius, military might, and being exceptionally good at getting married. He had at least 7 wives. each convinced her son was the rightful heir. Alexander's mother, Olympias, was a princess from Epirus, known for keeping snakes in her bedroom. Yes, really, she adored snakes, worshipped gods, and believed Alexander was the son of Zeus, not Philip. And Philip didn't argue, so Alexander grew up among dinner tables full of palace coups, in a hall filled with daggers, sacred serpents, and women whispering in ominous tones. From a young age, Alexander wasn't like other children. He rode like a warrior, fought like a prodigy, but what truly made adults wary and respectful was his mouth. He asked too many questions, debated too deeply, and reacted to stupidity faster than a sword could leave its scabbard. One time, when his father boasted of conquering the Thracians and proclaimed, "I have expanded our lands to where the sun rises," Alexander looked at him, raised an eyebrow, and replied, "Then the rest of the world I'll take care of." No, his father froze, and in that brief moment, perhaps he realized this boy was no ordinary child. At age 13, Alexander was sent to study under Aristotle, the greatest philosopher of the time. And yes, Alexander studied everything: philosophy, mathematics, poetry, geography, biology, but he still enjoyed arguing, in words and in fists. He memorized the Iliad so thoroughly he carried a handwritten copy with him like a lucky charm. He was obsessed with Achilles, the hero of Troy, and saw himself as a descendant. And so the dream began, to become immortal through victory. At 15, Alexander wasn't just a boy. While other teens were wrestling with essays like, "Why I Should Respect My Parents," Alexander was reading war chronicles, drawing battle strategies in the sand, and asking Aristotle whether a king who wanted to conquer the world and live virtuously should begin with war or with wisdom. Aristotle coughed and changed the topic to philosophy. Alexander was a brilliant student, but not the quiet, obedient kind. He studied to understand, to apply, and most of all to become greater than anyone who had ever lived. But he didn't care for idle theory. Alexander came alive when he was on horseback. Speaking of horses, have you heard the story of Bucephalus? It was a famous warhorse, jet black, massive, and extremely aggressive. No one could ride it. It threw off soldiers, bit trainers, and even made Philip II so furious he considered trading it to a more cooperative mule. But Alexander, only 12 years old at the time, stepped forward before the entire court and said the words that made everyone hold their breath. "Let me try." He approached the horse, no whip, no shouting, and simply turned its head toward the sun. And just like that, the horse calmed down. He leapt onto its back and galloped away before hundreds of stunned onlookers. When he returned, everyone still stood frozen. Philip II, so moved he shed a rare tear, embraced his son and said, "Macedonia is too small for you. Find a kingdom worthy of you." Sounds touching. But deep down, he was probably also thinking, "Oh no, if this boy gets any older, my own throne might be at risk." And indeed, it was, because the Macedonian royal court wasn't exactly a peaceful place to raise children. The palace had everything: conspiracies, assassins, ex-wives, new wives, wives who hated each other, half-brothers, and political feasts soaked in wine and sharp daggers. Alexander grew up in a power game that resembled an ancient reality show, and he learned early to survive. You had to think 3 moves ahead. As the son of a powerful and strong-willed mother, Alexander was often seen as a bit too dreamy, but no one could have guessed that those dreams shaped by Achilles' glory, Aristotle's philosophy, and the cold stares of backstabbers would forge him into a thinking war machine. At 16, when Philip went off to fight the Thracians, he left Alexander as acting regent, and within weeks, Alexander crushed a rebellion, founded a city, and named it Alexandropolis. Yes, exactly. A teenage boy without a full beard had already named a city after himself. Not out of arrogance, he just didn't think anyone else deserved the honor. At 18, Alexander entered the Battle of Chaeronea, his first real battle alongside his father, and he didn't just watch, he led the left wing, broke through the sacred band of Thebes, one of Greece's elite forces. After the battle, Philip looked at his son, probably feeling both proud and slightly uneasy. If this boy doesn't inherit my throne, he might just take it. And he was right. Just 2 years later, Philip II was assassinated, right at his daughter's wedding. In front of hundreds of powerful guests, the palace descended into chaos, and Alexander, he didn't cry. He didn't panic. Within days, he had full control of the kingdom. Philip's trusted men were invited to early retirement. Opponents disappeared overnight. Roxana, his future wife, began drawing attention, and the throne of Macedonia, once Philip's, now belonged to Alexander. Barely 20 years old, the world was not enough. It was 336 BCE. Alexander became king at age 20. While most Greek youth were just finishing philosophy school and looking for work, Alexander, his first move was to ensure no one else had enough breath left to challenge him. Half-brothers who ever dreamed of the throne silently vanished like morning mist. Nobles questioning his right to rule, judged behind closed doors, then shown out the back door, possibly the one that leads to the underworld. And once he was certain no one inside the kingdom was stirring, Alexander looked outward, specifically toward the east where the massive Persian Empire ruled most of the civilized world. Many advised him to take a break, wait, rebuild Macedonia, pray, marry, have children. But Alexander didn't like peace. To him, peace smelled like stagnation and hidden sorrow. He issued a sharp, clear declaration: Persia is mine. It sounds simple, but this was the most powerful empire on the planet at the time, stretching from Asia Minor all the way to India, with massive armies, treasure vaults overflowing with gold, and countless vassal kings who spoke the name of Darius III with reverent fear. And Alexander? He had just 40. 0 troops, a few hundred cavalrymen, and an ego as vast as the Greek sky. And so, he began to march, taking the first steps on a journey that would be recorded in history books, movie scripts, and yes, even in bedtime story videos like the one you're watching now. First battle, Granicus. Alexander crossed the Hellespont and stepped into Asia Minor Persian territory and immediately met the enemy's advance force. His generals, veterans from King Philip's campaigns, quickly advised, "Sire, wait for morning. Oh, it's getting dark. The river is deep. The Persians are defending the far bank." Alexander nodded, then rode his horse straight across the river. Why wait for morning? By then they'll be ready. It's more fun to strike now. And he won. Decisive. Thunderous victory that shook all of Asia Minor. Second battle, Issus. This time, Darius III himself entered the field. With an army 3 times larger, Darius was confident he could crush the young Macedonian. Reality? Alexander shattered the Persian line with a precise strike at the center, causing Darius to panic and flee. Yes, that's right. The king of Persia, once revered as a demigod, abandoned his mother, wife, and daughters in camp and ran for his life. Alexander captured the royal family, but didn't harm a hair on their heads. He even sent an apology to Darius's mother for his soldiers being a little rough. A strike both sharp and strangely ethical. Then came Tyre, the city that refused to kneel. Tyre was a fortified island, surrounded by walls and sea. When Alexander demanded surrender, they laughed. Alexander didn't like being laughed at, so he built a causeway across the sea, turned Tyre into a peninsula, brought up his siege engines, and took the city after 7 months of relentless assault. A victory that proved, in his dictionary, there was no such thing as impossible, only not yet built. Finally, Gaugamela, the decisive battle. This time, Darius brought nearly 200 men, war elephants, chariots with scythed wheels, every terror-inducing weapon available, and Alexander, still with his 40 men, but arranged in a formation so brilliant, it's still studied in military academies today. He feigned retreat, lured Darius into a trap, then punched through the center. Darius fled. Again. This time, for good. Persia fell. Alexander became king of Asia, king of Persia, king of all those who had once called him a barbarian. But you know what's strangest? The moment he conquered it all, he didn't go home. He didn't rest. He didn't throw a party. He didn't announce retirement. He looked east toward India and asked the question that made his generals go pale. What's beyond those mountains? What was beyond? India, a sacred, mysterious land full of jungles and unnamed rivers for Alexander. It wasn't just a spot on a map, it was an unanswered question. He already had it all: Persia, Egypt, all of Asia Minor, Syria, Phoenicia, Palestine, Bactria. Every proud kingdom lay beneath his heel. But it still wasn't enough. Alexander didn't just want to be king of the living, he wanted to become immortal. And deep down, he believed that beyond the Himalayas lay the proper ending to his legend. So eastward he went. The conquest of India began, not gently. First, the terrain, jungles, deep rivers, insects the size of soup spoons, and a climate like a 24/7 natural steam room. Then came the culture. The people didn't tremble, they philosophized. They debated with soldiers about reincarnation, karma, and directly asked, why conquer the world if everything is an illusion? Alexander went speechless for several minutes. No one had ever asked that in Persia. Then came the Battle of the Hydaspes River, one of the most brutal battles he ever fought. The opponent, King Porus, towering on a war elephant, regal, fierce, and very much not a fan of being invaded. The battle played out in heavy rain, on a muddy field, with elephants roaring, horses falling, and soldiers slipping around like they were in a figure skating contest. But Alexander won, with strategy, disciplina, and his signature brand of stubbornness. And yet he didn't kill Porus. When asked how he wished to be treated, the captured king raised his head high and answered, "As a king." "I," Alexander smiled. "You've just saved yourself." "I." He even returned the territory and allowed Porus to rule as an ally. That act has been remembered for millennia as proof that Alexander didn't just conquer with the sword, but with the respect he gave to those who deserved it. But after that, things began to fracture. His army, the same men who had followed him from Macedonia, through Arabia, over mountains, across rivers, building bridges, Winning wars were exhausted. The rain hadn't stopped. The jungle hadn't ended. And yet, new orders came. March forward. They no longer dreamed of glory. They just wanted to go home. At the Hyphasis River, Alexander gathered his troops, stood in the rain, and declared that they would press on. No one clapped. Silence. Then one voice spoke, then another, and finally, the whole army in the rain, not with thunderous cheers, but with bowed heads, refused. Alexander couldn't believe it. The man who defied everything, who crossed deserts on a prophecy, was now being abandoned by his own brothers in arms. He went into his tent, stayed inside for 3 days. No food, no sleep, no words. And then he emerged and agreed to turn back. The return journey, the tragedy begins. Alexander didn't take the safe route home. He led his army through the Gedrosian Desert, an infamous wasteland with no water, no shade, and nothing but death. He wanted to prove that if he couldn't expand the empire, he could at least do what no one had dared. The result? Over 1/3 of his army died from thirst, heat, and despair. By the time he reached Babylon, Alexander was changed. Still young, only 32, but in his eyes, there was something no longer of this world. He began to grow obsessed with divine rituals, held ceremonies worshiping himself as a living god, invited astrologers from India, asked questions to mystics, built temples in his own honor. The generals began to take a step back. The hero who had led them through countless victories was now conversing with spirits. His mind no longer lived on the map, but somewhere between the earth and the dream realm. Alexander started having strange dreams. He saw himself walking through seas of fire. He saw Heracles, his fallen kindred spirit, standing in a field, silently waving. He saw gates that no one was allowed to enter. And then the fever began. Babylon, 323 BCE. Alexander had returned from the damp jungles and sun-scorched deserts. Outwardly, he was the same, regal, clad in purple, with his divine sword at his side. But inside, something had changed. They said his eyes no longer looked forward, but into the void. He began dreaming of flying oxen, of the moon cracking in two, of snakes slithering out of banquet tables. And always Heracles was there. Smiling, sadly, Alexander no longer fought, no longer conquered. He began to build crimes. His new plan, a hybrid empire where Greeks and Persians would live together, marry, and rule side by side. He married Statira, daughter of King Darius in true conquer the nation, then marry the president's daughter style. He hosted a mass wedding for hundreds of his soldiers. He began wearing Persian robes, declared himself king of kings. No, and then requested to be worshipped as a deity. Some generals were shocked. Some smiled awkwardly. Others just poured another drink because arguing now was pointless. Then came the fateful night. After a banquet, Alexander felt cold. Not the kind from wind, but cold from within. The fever began. Then stomach pain. Then he couldn't stand. Then couldn't speak. Doctors surrounded him, checking pulses, applying herbs, bleeding him, praying, burning incense, placing stones, everything except knowing what was wrong. Some whispered he was poisoned. Others blamed intestinal infection. Some said malaria. One seer murmured, "This is an illness. It's judgment." But the truth, no one knew. Alexander, the man who shattered Persia, who rode across waterless deserts, who stood beneath arrow storms, shouting in 3 languages, now lay drenched in sweat, groaning, unable to speak. The generals gathered around his bed. They asked, "Sire, who will succeed you?" He opened his mouth. Some say he smiled. Some say he hissed. But legend leaves only 3 words. To the strongest. And then, silence. A silence that lasted. No one dared declare him dead. Because he wasn't decaying. 6 days. Skin still pink. Eyes still open. No odor. No flies. No sign of rot. And so, fear crept in. What if they declared the king is dead, and he sat up a few days later? At that point, it wouldn't just be treason. It would be a one-way ticket to being the temple floor tile forever. And when life truly left him, myth began to rise. A corpse that wouldn't rot. A dream unfinished. An empire without an heir. Whoever buried him would gain power. Whoever held the body would hold the legacy. So Alexander's body was stolen. Really stolen. Ptolemy, his close general, moved first. He rerouted the funeral procession, originally meant to take the body home to Macedonia, and veered it toward Egypt, placed him in Memphis, built a tomb, called it a temple. The other generals, outraged, but they too began dividing the spoils. Seleucus took Babylon, Antigonus claimed Asia Minor, Lysimachus seized Thrace, Cassander ruled Greece. Each said, "We're just keeping it safe for the heir." But in truth, each was building his own throne. And Alexander, no confirmed tomb, no universally accepted successor, no recorded last testament, only an empire so vast, no one could hold it. And then, he vanished. Not from history, from reality. His tomb, once visited by Roman emperors, once the site where Caesar knelt, once home to a body untouched by decay, for centuries vanished from the earth. Some say it was destroyed by earthquakes. Some say it was hidden. Some say it was erased by new religions. But the truth, no one knows. The death of Alexander didn't end with a bell. It ended with a silence that has lasted 2,000 years. And perhaps that's what made him a legend. Not how many battles he won, not how many kings he defeated, but because he died, and the world still wasn't sure he had truly died. Who succeeds him? A simple question. But the answer was war. The moment Alexander closed his eyes, his generals, men who had crossed deserts, climbed mountains, and sweated through Indian jungles with him, began to look at each other with the eyes of starving wolves. No one dared claim the title of new king. But no one wanted to be temporary caretaker of the throne either. So they all pretended to be humble. Cassander held Macedonia. Ptolemy claimed Egypt. Seleucus took Babylon. Antigonus secured Asia Minor. Lysimachus temporarily held Thrace. Each one repeated the familiar line, "I'm just holding it until the rightful heir is ready." Then quietly built palaces, dug moats, and hired personal assassins. The farce of succession began with a newborn. Alexander had a wife, Roxana, who was pregnant at the time. When the child was born, he was named Alexander IV and declared the new king. The only problem? The boy couldn't crawl yet, so the generals created a regency council, claiming to rule on behalf of the child. But in truth, fought fiercely to control the empire in his name. A civil war broke out, known as the Wars of the Diadochi, the Wars of the Successors. And, oh dear, it lasted longer than Alexander's entire reign. First, they eliminated all members of the Argead dynasty, the old royal family. Alexander's stepmother Cleopatra, not the famous one later, was executed. Alexander IV, the young heir, was strangled in the dark at the age of 13. Roxana, his mother, was disappeared. Alexander's entire bloodline, from glory to extinction, in 15 years. And once there was no one left to rule and name, the generals dropped the mask and openly crowned themselves. Alexander's empire now split into 4 major kingdoms. The kingdom of Egypt, Ptolemy. Ptolemy was the shrewdest of them all. He took Egypt, built a stable empire, and kept Alexander's body as a sacred relic of power. His dynasty lasted 300 years until Cleopatra VII, the one who famously loved Caesar and later took her own life with a cobra. The Seleucid Empire, Seleucus, ruled from Syria all the way to India. The empire was too vast, and eventually burst like an overinflated balloon. The Jews revolted. Persia broke away, and the army was always exhausted, marching from desert to snow in the same week. The kingdom of Macedonia, Cassander seized Alexander's homeland. But after the great king's death, the people no longer loved royalty, only the memory. Cassander was labeled the traitor who killed the king's son, and lost the throne within a few years, swallowed by history. The kingdom of Thrace, Lysimachus held the hard-to-reach territory of Thrace, but paranoia consumed him. He even killed his own son, fearing a coup. Later, he was killed by another general. The end. An entire generation of great generals died in betrayal, backstabbing, and poisoned raisins. None of them held onto anything solid for more than a lifetime. And Alexander? The empire he built in 13 years shattered in 50. But the strange thing is, his ideas didn't die. Though they killed his son, tore apart his lands, they kept the language and culture he spread. The cities named Alexandria continued to exist in Egypt, in Syria, even as far as Afghanistan. The Greeks, though a minority, remained the ruling class across parts of Asia and North Africa for centuries. Hellenistic culture, a blend of Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and Indian thought, became the foundation of Western science, art, and philosophy. And that is the strange tragedy of Alexander, a man who united the world with the sword, but whose death shattered it into 1,000 pieces. Yet from those fragments, a new civilization emerged and lasted through Rome and into today. Alexander died suddenly and young, at 32, in an unfinished palace in Babylon, with his ambition still burning and no successor to take his throne. But what's remarkable is that while his body was placed in a golden coffin and solemnly carried to Egypt, his vision was never buried. If his political power ended in death, his legacy began a life far longer than any empire. At least 20 cities bearing the name Alexandria were founded during his conquests, from Egypt to the Hellenized corners of Central Asia. These cities weren't just military outposts. They became cultural crossroads, hubs of science, philosophy, and ideas. Among them, Alexandria in Egypt shone brightest, home to a massive library that once held nearly 700,000 scrolls, gathering the knowledge of the entire ancient world under one roof. Though it was later destroyed by war and time, the spirit of inquiry, of collecting knowledge, of blending traditions, that was the seed Alexander planted from the very beginning. From a boy raised in Macedonia, taught by Aristotle, Alexander dreamed far beyond borders. When he became king, he didn't just want territory. He wanted to erase the lines between peoples. He wore Persian robes, married an Eastern princess, included Easterners in his government. At the time, these actions puzzled and alarmed his Greek generals. But from our modern perspective, it was visionary. He wasn't just the first to create a transcontinental empire. He was the first to believe in a world united in diversity, even if it was only a dream then. And from that dream, A new era was born, the Hellenistic period, which lasted more than 300 years after his death. In that time, Greek art merged with Persian symbols, Babylonian math met Indian astrology, and even Buddha statues took on the features of Apollo, the spirit of freedom, reason, discovery, and embracing difference spread widely, impacting later empires like Rome, and even shaping modern Western thought. But perhaps Alexander's greatest legacy doesn't lie in maps, libraries, or temples. It lies in the idea of a human being who dared to exceed all limits, even though he left no heir, no lasting dynasty, and his empire collapsed within decades. The image of a young man who conquered the world lived on as an eternal myth. The Romans worshipped him as a god, Caesar. In his youth, reportedly wept before a statue of Alexander, ashamed that at the same age, he had accomplished nothing. Muslim kings called him Iskandar and included him in the Quran as a great figure. In Ethiopia, he was told of in fairy tales. In Persia, he was both invader and wise ruler. In the West, he became the symbol of glory, ambition, and the ultimate human limit. Alexander left no throne, but he left the will to reach the impossible. No law but the longing to surpass the borders of nations, cultures, and race. No written manuscript but a question that still echoes unanswered. If he had lived another 10 or 20 years, would the world be as we know it today? And so tonight, while you drift into sleep, remember, there was once a man, younger than most modern presidents, who dared to dream, dared to act, and left a mark so deep that, even in death, he could never be forgotten. Alexander was not immortal, but the legend of him has never died. There's a story that when Julius Caesar conquered Egypt, he visited Alexander's tomb. Upon seeing the preserved body still embalmed and carefully kept, Caesar bowed his head, wept, and whispered, "I too will leave something behind." Like he did 100 years later, Augustus, the first Roman emperor, also made a visit, leaving a golden crown on the tomb as a quiet admission. No emperor ever rose without walking in the shadow of Alexander, and yet, as if by strange fate, even his final resting place did not survive. Alexander's once magnificent tomb was slowly destroyed over the centuries by war, by earthquakes, or simply by forgetfulness. To this day, no one knows exactly where it is. Despite 2 centuries of archaeological search, some say his body lies hidden beneath a church. Some say it was stolen during the Middle Ages. Some believe it was erased from history by those jealous of a light that burned too brightly. And perhaps it is that very disappearance that made him immortal. Because for more than 300 years since his death, from the dawn of Rome to the age of the internet, Alexander has continued to be remembered. In textbooks, in poetry, in monuments, in films. People didn't just study him, they imitated him. Napoleon Bonaparte once asked painters to portray him like Alexander, wearing a cloak, riding a horse, chin held high. Hitler, though his moral compass was its opposite, was obsessed with Alexander's tactics, trying to mimic his lightning-fast cross-border assaults. Even in pop culture, from strategy games to Hollywood blockbusters, the name Alexander still carries the glow of the undefeated. And that's the strangest thing of all. Alexander lived only 32 years. He left no constitution, wrote no books, founded no religion. He had no heir, no organized legacy. But he left behind an inspiration, a quiet echo in the hearts of future generations, that a single human being, with a will strong enough, a mind sharp enough, and a heart burning hot enough, can shake the world. And if tonight you're lying quietly in the dark, listening to the hum of a fan and the soft current of this story, remember, you don't have to be another Alexander. But if you've ever carried a dream, small or grand, then you already share something with him that cannot be buried: longing. Because, as Alexander once said, nothing is impossible for the one who dares. And maybe this story of Alexander isn't just to help you sleep well, but to help you wake up carrying a little piece of legend within yourself. Rewind the clock to a summer morning in ancient Macedonia, where the Mediterranean breeze mingled with the metallic scent of swords. In a modest stone palace, a boy was born in 356 BCE, bearing a name no one had heard before, but which the world would one day be forced to remember: Alexander. His mother was Olympias, a princess of Epirus, beautiful, cunning, and wrapped in mystery. People whispered that she believed herself descended from Achilles, and even declared that Alexander was the son of Zeus. Not immortal, no one dared question her, and Alexander since childhood carried an obsession that he was not merely a man, but destiny. His father was Philip II, king of Macedonia, a brutal yet brilliant strategist. Philip was not gentle with his son, but he knew what Alexander needed: wisdom. And so, when Alexander turned 13, Philip hired one of the greatest minds in Greece, Aristotle. They didn't just study literature, they studied astronomy, politics, medicine, poetry, philosophy, and how to read the map of a world that had never been drawn. Aristotle did not teach Alexander to become a king. He taught him to become a symbol. Alexander memorized the Iliad, Homer's epic, so deeply that he carried a handwritten copy with him throughout every campaign. In his mind, Achilles, the hero of the epic, was not a character. He was a guide. Alexander lived as if he were writing the Iliad Part 2 with himself as the main character. And in his youth, there was another defining moment: the horse named Bucephalus. It was a fierce war horse, untamable, dangerous, and feared by all. Most believed it should be killed before someone got hurt. But Alexander, just 12 years old at the time, noticed something others hadn't. The horse isn't afraid of people. It's afraid of its own shadow. So he led the horse toward the sun, forcing its shadow to fall behind. And gently, as if he had been born for it, he mounted the animal with ease. From that moment on, Bucephalus and Alexander became an unstoppable pair. From Greece to Persia, across the Middle East, over the Indus River, they rode together, writing chapters of blood and glory. But even as a boy, Alexander came to know the dark side of power. He witnessed his father marry a new wife, one who soon gave birth to a son, a threat. At a banquet, when a drunken general loudly proclaimed that Macedonia now had a legitimate heir, Alexander leapt to his feet, drew his sword, and shouted, "Then what am I? A bastard with no father?" After that night, he fled the palace with his mother, but he never fled from the dream. 1 year later, Philip was assassinated on the day of his daughter's wedding. No one knows who orchestrated it. Rumors swirled. Alexander knew. Olympias planned it. The court devoured itself. The truth was buried in blood. But Alexander didn't miss the opportunity. At 20, he became king of Macedonia, and on his very first day, he executed all who doubted him, from rival relatives to nobles to dissenting generals. None were spared. He was young, but he knew, in the game of kingship, survival isn't about mercy, it's about resolve. And then, only a year into his reign, Alexander lifted his gaze eastward. There lay Persia, the most powerful empire of the ancient world. Now within reach, a child born into mythic dreams, raised on philosophical knowledge, and forged in the blood of his own dynasty, was now ready to go beyond Greece, beyond the legacy of his forefathers, to claim the glory of the gods.